Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and welcome to the show. My guest this week is writer-director Robert Budreau, a filmmaker whose credits include That Beautiful Somewhere, Bankstas, and the 2009 short film The Deaths of Chet Baker. His new feature, Born to be Blue, examines the jazz legend from a different direction, casting Ethan Hawke as the trumpeter at what might have been the lowest point in his life. The film opens in Toronto this Friday, March 11th, at the TIFF Bell Lightbox, and expands across Canada in the coming weeks. In the US, it'll be in theaters on March 25th, and available on demand March 31st. Robert chose a knockout, Raging Bull, Martin Scorsese's 1980 biopic starring Robert De Niro as Jake La Motta, a champion boxer whose athletic ferocity and domestic volatility are, at least in Scorsese's vision, inextricably linked, wrapped up in an angry box of Catholicism, insecurity, and ego. De Niro won his second acting Oscar for his unforgettable performance, and Thelma Schoonmaker took Best Film Editing. And while they didn't win their respective categories, Scorsese, Joe Pesci, Kathy Moriarty, and cinematographer Michael Chapman were just as deserving. This is a film for the ages, and as Robert will tell you, there are some very good reasons for that. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Often my original impulse is to think of something recent, like from the last couple of years, what's something that really struck me. But I think for this, I was just really thinking about a film that was kind of like really deeply meaningful to me, and something that maybe also kind of influenced my latest film, Born to be Blue. And this was a film, Raging Bull, that Ethan and I talked a lot about and looked to, even though they're very different movies, but there's some similarities, and so I thought it would be appropriate to pick Raging Bull.
Yeah, I've seen it a number of times theatrically. I was showing you the Criterion Laserdisc before we started this DVD. Every time it's released, I go back to it and just watched it again last week. And what amazed me this time around was that it wasn't the film that I remembered. It's fluid in a way that a lot of Scorsese's films aren't, and that this time it seemed really clearly a movie about frustration. Like, it's a really Catholic film, but the nature of its Catholicism was different this time around, and I'm just trying to figure out if that was me being like 47 and older and not necessarily wiser, but just more attuned to that frequency of it this time, or if it's always had that same hook and I just never noticed it. I mean, I'm sure it has. The movies don't change.
Yeah.
But for you, what was the attraction?
Well, I think, one of the things I love about it is, even though it's a period film, set in the 40s and 50s, it's really timeless. And I think, obviously the black and white kind of adds to that to a certain degree. But I think for me, like, I first saw the movie when I was maybe 13 or 14.
Okay.
And so for me, I've gone back to it, and I'm now 42, and so I've gone back to it over, almost 30 years, and like yourself, I see different things at it in different decades of my life. Like I didn't see, the Scorsese's Catholicism so much when I was 13. Yeah. I saw this amazing actor, Robert De Niro, who I hadn't really seen before, because I saw that before Taxi Driver, and then I went off on a De Niro Scorsese binge. And I saw the kind of the violence and the showiness of the boxing just really struck me. But I think over time, because there's a certain like poetic, enigmatic, expressionistic kind of quality to the movie, and there's a lot of great understated stuff, and the sound design is so precise that you can keep finding new things. So I've probably seen it 30 or 40 times over the last 30 years, and I keep seeing new things, and it means different things to me, and that's what tells me it's a great movie, is that it just holds up, and it always means something different.
Yeah, I'm still kind of dazzled by the performance, like by De Niro's, just his absolute disappearance into Jake La Motta, into the way that the film is. It's just so brutally unsympathetic. We understand that he's in pain and that it's mostly self-inflicted, but the idea that in 1980 that it was possible to make a film about a man this unpleasant and make the film as unpleasant 4 years after Rocky, which came from the same studio,
same producers, Winkler and Chartoff. Yeah.
It's remarkable to me that the film even exists. That they were smart enough to do both sides of that argument. But it is, it's Rocky, and I'm thinking about it now, obviously, because of Creed and the resurgence of Stallone, and the fact that by the time this podcast drops, he may have won an Oscar for playing Rocky Balboa, which he didn't do in '76, which is still kind of bizarre. Yeah. But of course, De Niro was nominated for Taxi Driver. Like, it's such a bizarre echo that this film we should be talking about it now in relation to Rocky, in relation to the fact that there's a 7th Rocky movie now and it's back in the world. There will not be there is apparently a sequel to Raging Bull, or someone bought the rights to.
There's a big lawsuit about that.
Yeah, the Bronx Bull is, I think, what they ended up titling it, with William Forsythe. And I don't see time coming back around to the franchise, or I don't see a Raging Bull franchise happening quite the same way the Rocky films did.
No, that's such a standalone, I think, kind of performance and a kind of time capsule thing. I think, I think that one of the other things that I think is so magical about that movie is that you can tell it's deeply personal for Scorsese and for De Niro. I mean, De Niro was trying to talk Scorsese into doing it for many, many, many years, and Scorsese did it at a dark time in his life when he was sick and he was exploring himself, and you can really feel both De Niro's personal need to do the movie and Scorsese's, and I think those are, for whatever reason, those kinds of movies tend to be the ones. Even a film like Vertigo, which is one of Hitchcock's most personal movies, it's interesting how those movies are the ones that really stand the test of time, even though they're not like overtly personal. Like, it's not about Scorsese's life in Little Italy or growing up in New York or something, but you can really tell it's the whole Catholic thing, which the more I watch, the more I see of that.
I mean, I was raised conservative Jewish, and really don't practice or follow any of it. Yeah. But the Catholicism of Raging Bull is the Catholicism that I kind of worry about. Yeah. When people talk about growing up heavily religious, it's like, that'll destroy it. That'll ruin you. Yeah. Because what you see in the film is someone who can only, I mean, Ebert summed it up beautifully, who was a Catholic himself. It's a film about a man who can only relate to women as virgins or whores, and the minute they're no longer virgins, he can't relate to them at all. Yeah. Like, his La Motta's relationship with his wife is framed through such loathing and jealousy and this weird kind of whirlpool pathology that he creates for himself, where he's really in every scene where he's not fighting someone, he's waiting to fight with someone. And the frustration that comes out in him when he doesn't get to fight in the ring, invariably it attacks his brother or it attacks his wife, and I see it almost as a separate entity. I don't even think that it's him, because he's so completely unconscious of his own, or not unconscious, but he's so completely unaware of his own motivations. He really doesn't know what makes him tick. Yeah. And so La Motta becomes this fascinating figure of pure anger, but he's not smart enough to be stopped. Like, you can't talk him down, because he'll just hear the word he wants to hear and go on and fasten on that. Like the idea, why you say you? Why did you say and you? When you say these guys' names, why'd you put your name in there? Why would you do that? It's like, well, because I was trying to tell you that a lot of people exist in the world. Yeah, but you said you. Well, okay, I see where this is going. And I get just there's never a good end to anything that happens with him, and the movie is this progressive descent until we finally see what happens when he directs his Rage It himself, when there's literally nothing else to hit. Yeah. And it's so compelling, but it's so ugly and unpleasant and willing to show you that. And I weirdly associate that with the Catholic images of the crucified Christ, because there's always blood. There's always so much of the actual viscera, and the idea of people sticking their hands in his side, and disbelievers and everything else. And a lot of the other Christian religions, or the offshoots of Christianity, tend to sanitize it or whitewash it and just sort of back away from it. But Scorsese, if you've seen Last Temptation, he'll show you everything that he can show you. And here it's like a trial run for that, but it's all mixed up with this post-cocaine rage, confusion. I mean, he just made 4 movies back to back, I think, or 5 if you count The Last Waltz. like Alice and
That's
or Mean
right.
Streets and Alice and Taxi Driver and The Last
New
Waltz
York,
in
New
New York, and they almost cumulatively killed him.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the story goes, I don't know if it's true or not, but I kind of want to believe it, that De Niro went to see him in the hospital and said, now we make Raging Bull.
Yeah.
As though it was the project that would save him, when a movie of this intensity would probably kill anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's also the kind of cathartic nature of the whole Catholic thing with Scorsese, because, you know, the climax of the film is literally De Niro, like, in a Christ-like position on the ropes, bloody, like,
Yeah.
And it kind of builds towards that, and you know, in some ways, Scorsese kind of followed it up with The King of Comedy and some kind of lighter, well, I mean, still dark comedies in the grand scheme of things, but a different type of filmmaking for him. And in some ways, I almost see that as him kind of redeeming himself for getting that maybe out of his system or something. Like, I think,
This does feel
never
like
mind
a
the fact that it was
summation.
it wasn't, I don't think, successful box office wise, but critically it was.
Oh yeah, critically
It was very well received, obviously, and
Premiere named it the movie of the 80s, if I remember.
Yeah, a lot of
correctly.
people did.
Yeah.
and so
It does seem like a summation in a lot of ways of Scorsese's early period, because you're right, he gets immediately calmer. His films get more relaxed.
well, he also, you get the sense that he basically, in terms of that all the different techniques, he like almost everything is in Raging Bull, like, you know, the use of off speed, which is, he uses it all the time, the use of zoom, the use of, like, every trick in the book he pulls out and makes work in that. And if you look at Taxi Driver and all those films, things like that, he's experimenting with them, but in Raging Bull it's like he's mastered them all and put them all together in one big, and then, yeah, you're right, after that his things are a little bit more straight ahead. And then I feel like in 1990, 10 years later, he did Goodfellas,
Right.
with Pesci and De Niro, and he came up with this new style, which led us to where he even is now, in a sense. Like, that was more of a style informed by commercials and music videos a little bit. There was a snappier quality to that style, and that was like a different phase.
Yeah.
Between 1980 and 1990, it was its own kind of strange beast, I think. But
Yeah. He's such a fascinating filmmaker because he goes into the wilderness in these weird ways. Like, he makes Raging Bull and blows all of that out, and then goes off and does King of Comedy and After Hours and Last Temptation, and then he does Goodfellas, and then he's immediately, well, what are you going to do next? Oh, I'm going to remake Cape Fear, and then I'm going to do The Age of Innocence, and I'm going to make a slow, calm movie that's just furious underneath. But and Kundun and all these movies that people kind of forget because they want to chase the gangster pictures. They want to chase the most vivid Scorsese picture, because that sense of filmmaking, that style thing he does, is like a drug. Like New York Stories being, I think, the most distilled version of it.
Right, yeah.
But he's so good when he's observant and calm and quiet, and you see that in Raging Bull as well. You see that in the
time.
in the the 10 or 15 minutes between explosions, where you're just watching it build, and it's almost calm and it's almost safe, like the home movie footage and the scene, just his early flirtations. They're or the couple's early flirtations, they're almost sweet, except that we know that there's absolutely no way this ends well, and this is only going to.
No, I love again. That's one of the things I love about the movie, is how he juxtaposes the overly stylized fight sequences with super simple, super naturalistic dramatic scenes, which are just so simply staged. And I know they ended up shooting those scenes very, very quickly, and the fight scenes took them forever to do. And that's where so much of their time. Never mind the fact that De Niro had to do all the weight, and that had its own issues. But I love that, how he's able to kind of mesh those kind of two styles together. So on one hand, the film feels so improvised and naturalistic. On the other hand, it's insanely stylized. And he's able to marry that, because usually it's one of the trickiest things as a director, is to try to find a tone, or at least try to unify your tone, and without it becoming a bit of a mess. And
Born to Be Blue has a sort of device that it employs to not disconnect the stories, but to demonstrate that part of it is a fiction and part of it is not. And it's a dramatic interpretation in any case, but when you're sort of shifting between those two modes of storytelling, it's very similar, I think, to what Scorsese does, where he ramps right up into pure stylization for the fight sequences, and then comes back down to earth for these kitchen sink moments, which almost feel like they're pulled out of Who's Knocking at My Door, where it's just like all we have are the actors and some walls.
Like Cassavetes film or something. And that was one of the tricks in Born to Be Blue, is that I wanted create what I knew was kind of a stylized device to kind of poke fun at the biopic and have this film within a film thing, which really did happen. So to try to kind of capture a bit of that Charlie Kaufman-esque kind of fun, but yet still give the whole film a unified tone and still make sure that it doesn't just feel too much all over the place. And also to try to connect it to jazz music, which is by its nature improvisational. So it's like, how loose do you let it be? And it's kind of finding that balance. And it was one of the things another thing I love about Raging Bull is that, it is a biopic on Jake La Motta, but you'd never know it. It feels just like a story, and it doesn't, even though it's got the montages of boxing, which is kind of classic biopic stuff, but yet I don't even think of it as a biopic in a way. That's what I love. That's one of the things I loved about it. And I know when he worked with Paul Schrader and Mardik Martin on the script, they did the usual things where the Joe Pesci character was actually a combined two characters. He didn't really exist. And the whole triangle that they set up there between, the hero and then the brother mentor figure and then the woman was kind of, for Ethan and I, a bit of a model for Born to Be Blue as well, because in Chet Baker's life, Dick Bach was the manager, and in our film that's Callum Keith Rennie, and then the female love interest was in our film Carmen Yogo and Raging Bull, it was Kathy Moriarty. But that the kind of the triangle relationship and how you can kind of use that power was kind of inspirational for us. I mean, again, still very different movie, but
yeah. Well, I mean, I think the how can I put this? I would guess that the audience's imagination of what Chet Baker will be like is kind of weirdly similar to how Scorsese and De Niro depict La Motta, which is that he's this kind of uncontrollable self-destructive force that if you wrap him correctly, if you position him properly, you can direct him into something beautiful, wonderful, usable, memorable. Like La Motta in The Ring was apparently, we don't see it in the film because it's so subjective and we're usually just watching him get punched in the face, but he was apparently the Tyson of his age. Like he just came out and destroyed anything that was in front of him.
Yeah.
And now with the rise of with the popular narrative about Tyson and and Toback's documentary and all that stuff that have followed, we sort of see the echoes even more vividly in Raging Bull of the Tyson persona, the absolute destructive force that only works when you point him that way.
A raw, animalistic kind of.
Yeah. But with Baker, you get beauty. Like you get unvarnished, like there's nothing that isn't gorgeous about listening to him.
Yeah.
There's no, like, you don't hear the rage, you don't hear the self-destruction. You kind of do with Charlie Parker in a weird way, I think, in the same, in terms of the era. But I don't know enough about jazz to go in any further on that point. But I find it really fascinating that you can even begin to draw the parallel, and not you, but anyone, and it can be done.
Well, I think the thing that fascinates me about Chet Baker is that, that there always is a darkness under the surface of those beautiful love songs that he always played a little flat, a little off. Like there's always kind of something brooding there, and that's kind of where the conflict comes in. With Jake La Motta, it's more on the surface. Like it becomes very apparent because he's just cursing and punching people and so it's much less subtle in that sense.
He's a guy who doesn't go inside himself very much.
No,
I don't think La Motta has an inside.
No. But there's a certain darkness and a certain self-destructiveness that I think they share, and I think a lot of heroin addicts share. And a certain, one of the other interesting things about Raging Bull is just how it treats sex and the mix of sex and violence and then back to the religion again and the intersection of those themes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's, the whole idea of sex isn't something that we really explored too much in Born to Be Blue, partly just because I wanted to focus on certain things. But in Raging Bull, it's just very interesting, and it goes back to what you were talking about the kind of the virgin personification of the female, and that's kind of a very Hitchcockian thing too. Like even in Taxi Driver, the De Niro character falls for I'm forgetting her name now, Sybil Shepherd, who is kind of a classic Hitchcockian blonde, not like a virgin like Catherine Moriarty is in Raging Bull, but I remember the last time I watched Raging Bull, one of the shots that that always sticks out to me is some of the first shots of her at the pool in slow motion with the white dress, kind of flapping her legs, and De Niro just watching her. It's like he's seen an angel come.
Yeah.
And coming off of this terrible relationship with his wife, he's like found this virgin angel. And then as soon as he marries her and they get together, you know, things kind of turn, like you said, quite quickly.
And the film just, I mean, I think it spends maybe 2 minutes on any concept of domestic happiness. It's in the home movies where everybody's smiling.
Yeah.
And then it's over. Like, it's just instantly gone.
Yeah. But, I mean, the reality is that happiness isn't all that interesting within the context of a movie like that anyways. And
Sure.
so Scorsese's just looking for the conflict and the darkness. And I think... it is, I mean, I think it's just such a brave film in that sense. Like, I think a lot of people since Raging Bull always look to that to say, oh, look, I can get away with an unsympathetic character. Usually what happens is they create an unsympathetic character and it doesn't work, and people hate the character and the film doesn't work often. Because it's very, very tricky to get away with such a blatantly unsympathetic character and make your movie work. Like, it's very, very bold. Most people cannot pull that off. And I just, whenever I watch it, I think, how do they get away with that? But it's just because it's so captivating. And when you see De Niro doing that stuff, you know people like that. You know, like I grew up being a jock, an athlete. I played sports all my life, and you kind of see. And I also grew up, in a small town, Ingersoll, which is a couple hours from here, kind of an industrial town. And you kind of see there's a certain darkness that De Niro had that I remember seeing in the factories and stuff, like the blue collar kind of frustration and darkness that you see combined with some of the sports mentality. And that's what I think sticks with me about Raging Bull 2, is that it's so truthful and universal, like that darkness. It's not just theatrics, he's being an asshole. Like it's so kind of real and naturalistic, and that speaks to how much preparation they put into it too. Like, I mean, I think, you know, reading about Raging Bull and the amount of time that De Niro spent working with Pesci and Catherine Moriarty. Pesci and Moriarty both were non-actors, really. Like, and the fact that
Pesci and Frank Vincent had made some B movie that he noticed,
and she was some girl that he knew on the street, and like the fact that Scorsese had two of his leads that never even acted before, and they were so amazing. Like, Pesci should have got the Oscar for that. I mean, he's just so brilliant in that movie.
Yeah.
Again, it's so bold and so good.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch those scenes now and realize that, you know, not only did the actors kind of have to figure out where they were, but there's also the whole, and we mentioned this, but there's also the whole thing about Rocky hanging over their heads. It's like, you know, can it be nicer? Can it be better? And no one goes there. Like, nobody drifts towards it. No one drifts towards sympathy. Pesci never blinks. Moriarty is kind of icy from the beginning, as though she knows it's not going to end well, or at least she's practiced. And it's one of those things where she was 18 when they started shooting. It's like unimaginable to me that she gives a performance that's composed and as stable as that in this whirlwind of a movie.
Yeah.
And De Niro just doesn't. Like, there's a movie called The Iceman with Michael Shannon, Winona Ryder, Franco's in it. It's got this huge cast, but the entire movie comes down to Michael Shannon not giving an inch, just being a complete brick to everybody around him, because he's a sociopath and he's murdered. By the end of the film, he'll say he's murdered dozens of people. May or may not be true. The movie takes his confessions, the character's confessions, as true. And Shannon just does this amazing thing about not giving anything back to an actor in a scene. Just absolutely nothing. And De Niro, I've thought about that watching Raging Bull this time, because it's incredible to watch him not listening to people, but still be involved.
Yeah.
Like, you can tell that De Niro is working with the actors, even as his La Motta is completely ignoring them. Yeah. It's just fascinating. It's this thing that doesn't happen, and it happens. Yeah. I mean, even in the scene at the very end when he's reciting the speech from On the Waterfront, which should have so much meaning, and which does have so much meaning, he is showing us somehow that he as an actor understands that La Motta doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
And the movie can show us that. And the levels of observation in the film are just so incredible and complex to me that I think that's why I see something different every time, because this time it's just like, well, what angle am I being directed to? What am I being shown?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Yeah, and I think some of the nuance in the repetition and the dialogue scenes between De Niro and Pesci, like, you know, you can tell that they feel so spontaneous and naturalistic, but you know that they've clearly worked them to kind of get to that point. For me as a director, you know, after I've seen it so many times, I start looking beyond that and looking at the technique of it all. And it's something that strikes me the more I see it, is just the use of repetition. Like, a lot of the scenes, De Niro will ask Pesci the same thing like 5 times, and Pesci will repeat the same thing 4 times, because that's people talk in a very messy way. Yeah. And a lot of the scenes, like even the first scene when he meets Catherine Moriarty, it's just like grunts and half audible haze and just this very simplistic, naturalistic dialogue. And to me, that's what gives it such an authentic thing. And I think, you know, I remember reading the original script, or one of versions of the script.
Right.
I think it was Paul Schrader's rewrite. And, you know, it kind of bears a resemblance to the movie, but there's so much is different. Like, the core is there, but it's funny because that's really not a movie that's a plot-driven script kind of film. Like, you know, it has its own kind of magical energy, and a lot of the big monologues and soliloquies that were written all got thrown out the window and are replaced by like looks or grunts, which is often the case.
And it's all it needs in this case.
Yeah. He's not a talkative guy. I mean, and that's, again, like Chet Baker and Born to Be Blue, you know, we tried to limit the amount of long speeches Ethan had because Chet Baker did not like to talk. Some of those guys are just not verbal guys. I mean, Ethan actually is an extremely verbal guy. Yeah, and so sure. I was trying to keep him from not talking so much because his default is to have big dialogue scenes. He's done a lot of those kind of movies, which he's done very well.
But then you see him in something like Sinister, and it's like he's just watching and reacting, and it's just as interesting. I said this when Boyhood came out. I think it's like nobody noticed, and he turned into the best actor of his generation. Where he's just suddenly become as good as he always was, but now we catch it. Now we can see it.
No, I think there's a lot of actors, and Ethan in particular. They have another renaissance in their 40s, where I think. Their kind of cumulative experience and maturity kind of come together in a way, and they're also confident with themselves and where they're at. And I was lucky to kind of have Ethan on this project when he was like really right now at his, like, I think really at his prime, like you say, and kind of able to do whatever and just be so so collaborative and passionate about it. So yeah, it was great.
You said that you and he had conversations that were similar to, or that you used Raging Bull as a touchstone. I'm just really curious about if you can expand on that, because that just sounds like something. It's a big signifier to have while you're working on something completely different. So how did it come up?
I think on a lot of different fronts. Like I think one of the things that attracted Ethan to Born to Be Blue was the fact that it wasn't a traditional biopic. And when we talked about how to approach a person's life and the inherent fictions in a lot of traditional biopics, and Raging Bull was a movie that kept coming up partly because it was period, because it did have a black and white aesthetic, but because it was a biopic done in a kind of a naturalistic way, and the kind of the merging again of the stylization and the naturalism, right? I think from Raging Bull, and I think also how to deal with dark characters. I mean, in that case, they didn't worry about Jake La Motta even being sympathetic. In our case, we chose a year in Chet Baker's life in the late '60s where he actually had a comeback, and it was inherently sympathetic,
right? And
so that was to our advantage because, and I think Ethan Hawke as an actor and as a person he is just a nice, down-to-earth guy. That is who Ethan Hawke is. I think Robert De Niro is probably a very different person. Every actor is different in their own ways. And so I think with Ethan, we had a more sympathetic base to start from already, which then allowed us to potentially push into darker areas because we knew that we wouldn't lose the audience. Because, the last thing you want to do, of course, is lose the audience, unless your whole movie is just relentlessly dark like Raging Bull. But that was never our model. So, we kind of used it in different ways. And I think the way You know, Raging Bull is also a very jazzy movie. Like, there's a lot of jazz. Like, there is a lot of jazz. Harry James, Scorsese's like 3 or 4 Harry James tracks. Harry James was one of Chet Baker's icons. You know, Benny Goodman. There's a lot of jazz in the movie and the use of sound design. So that wasn't necessarily something Ethan and I spoke about at length, but that was something that was kind of inspiring for us.
Yeah.
And I think just designing the relationships, because Ethan and I kind of worked the script quite a bit in the summer leading up to shooting the movie. And I think one of the things that Ethan was pushing me to do was to play up the relationship and play up the female lead character in order to kind of provide a different window into Chet Baker and his life. Not just focus on, because everyone knows once the comeback story starts that to a certain degree you see the arc and you know that he's going to probably improve and he's going to have a final concert. What happens you don't know, but that's a kind of an archetypal comeback story. But the love story is something that can kind of provide a unique window in him. And so he really pushed me to expand that and try to connect that relationship between the lover or wife figure and the kind of brother mentor figure, which is in our case the Dick Bach character, right, played by Callum Keith Rennie. So and we just both, I think, just love the movie and the poetry of it. And so it just became one of several kind of movies that we talked about. And I even know even the quote at the end of the movie, which is a biblical quote. I mean I'm not particularly religious. I actually did grow up Catholic, but I wasn't I don't think I was that good of a Catholic.
Scorsese Catholic.
I wasn't that hardcore of a Catholic. But there's a quote at the end of Raging Bull, which again speaks to kind of how personal it was for Scorsese. But once I was blind and now I could see, and I remember Ethan and I just talking about what that meant and the themes, and it's just nice to have touchstones with an actor to jam about, because it also helps create the relationship and a mutual understanding of things. Whether or not you use them sometimes in the movie or not isn't even sometimes important. It's just building that trust.
Yeah.
And the best way to build trust is through content and through talking about other things besides just, because it gets a bit boring always just talking about your own movie. Like, you get pretty sick of it.
Yeah, I can imagine too. I mean, it would be nice to escape. Like stories about Edgar Wright showing his cast movies and movies and movies just on their nights off after while shooting Scott Pilgrim here. He would take over the Bloor and have double bills and bring in, like, he had his cinematographer here, so he brought him on to do a couple of his films, Dick Pope, An Evening with Dick Pope or something like that. And just, it's amazing how much of cinema and television culture that acts as a common language for everybody, but there's just not enough pieces of pop culture that are admired for being unforgiving as Raging Bull. And maybe also there was a brief vogue, I guess it's still around, where people just embrace Scarface for the same reasons, because it's about a badass.
Yeah.
But if you watch Raging Bull and think this is about a badass, you kind of miss every point that there is in it. And so that's it, right? Like, you're communicating, not only are you communicating with each other about the film itself and its aesthetic, but also understanding like what it means and sort of agreeing on that together before you can proceed.
Well, I think to me that, like, the reason that a film like Raging Bull is so much braver and ultimately stronger than a Scarface, not that Scarface isn't a great movie, but is that it's Scarface is one of those movies that people can see and think, oh, that's cool, that's sexy. Like, there's nothing really cool and sexy about Jake La Motta.
Yeah.
It's just dark, and in some ways Scarface is almost just over the top pop culture bad, and that people kind of think is cool. I think that's much easier to get away with, and that's, in some ways, that's a much more current sensibility, whereas Raging Bull has a, like I said, like a timeless, old-fashioned sensibility where he's not there. Like, at no point is De Niro trying to look cool.
Yeah.
Or be cool. And that was another thing that Ethan and I talked quite a bit about, because Chet Baker was the prince of cool, the James Dean of jazz. You know, he was the epitome of cool. But it's not cool to actually play cool, and so. And it's tricky for an actor not to be kind of self-reflective like that, and not try to worry about posing and being cool, and something that we talked quite a bit about not worrying about that, because that's what often makes you cool in the end, is if you just don't care about that, sure. Right?
I have strived to perfect this, and never made it work.
No.
yeah, and there's absolutely no question, like, De Niro doesn't care if he comes off well, and I think that's sort of the whole point of the character is if he does come off well, they've screwed up. Like, they haven't got it right if you can actually empathize with him. But in the end, you get this portrait of somebody who is, like, absolutely complicit in his misery and his suffering and spreading it to everybody else in a way that almost is understandable in the standard biopic arc, except that they've subverted absolutely everything about it because there's no redemption and there's no self-awareness and there's no release. You get to watch it turn inwards. Like, I'm kind of amazed that he didn't just die of a million cancers at the age of 40 because of everything he was bottling up. But it's just unthinkable that there's a positive spin that you could put on it. It doesn't want one, and it won't apologize for that. It's kind of amazing and unforgiving that way.
No, I think, in the last quarter of the movie, when he's given up boxing and he's kind of a fat, overweight promoter, you've got this tiny acknowledgement of a bit of redemption when he tries to make up with Joey, his brother. But it's so subtle, and it never really even goes anywhere. You see him kind of kissing him in a very awkward way in the parking lot, almost strangely kissing him. And then there's nothing beyond that. There's no happy scene with him and his brother having made up or not. So you get the sense like it probably didn't quite work out. And you're left with him at the club in this pathetic kind of place. And I guess his wife had left at the time.
Well, yeah, because he's dating the burlesque.
Yeah, he's got some like young underage girls, but I think the way that Scorsese frames the film, which has become such a common technique, and Scorsese himself has used quite a bit, of starting kind of at the end and then framing it around, is interesting because it has a certain effect. Obviously, in this is a movie about a journey. There's no big mystery to this, so right off the bat where you're kind of going, and they're not apologetic about that. But it does have an effect at the end of a lot of biopics in particular. They end, and then there's often text about what happens next. Everyone wants to, in this day and age, everyone leaves the theater Wikipediaing it, saying, okay, what's going to happen next? In Raging Bull, you leave that movie. First of all, Scorsese, instead of cutting to, like, in the 60s, Jake La Motta did this or that, he cuts to a biblical quote and he thanks his teacher. So there isn't anything like that. But you don't really... When I finish watching that movie, I don't even care to think about what happens to Jake La Motta after that, partly because we feel like it's this kind of universal circle. And I think that's another reason why it doesn't almost feel like a biopic to me.
Well, it gives you nothing. Like, it gives you no comfort.
No.
He made up with his brother, and his family eventually recognized that he was an okay guy. No, none of that. It's just... And then you're in the abyss. Like, you're left there with him. It's that emptiness is there. It's like, it's the end of the rapture. Like, how long do you have to stay here? Forever. There's no out. And that, it feels like a purgative for Scorsese. Like, this is, I left this here. I'm walking away. This is as much of this guy as I can handle showing you, and now we're done. But it's so just ballsy. It's just incredibly brave. And
I think framing it throughout with this kind of classical Italian Bologna orchestra music is also obviously adds to that kind of poetic expressionistic tone to juxtapose that classical music with the boxing imagery. But if, like, the start of the movie is this off-speed, foggy black and white classical music thing, it clearly sets you up in a kind of thematic, poetic world of boxing, which people hadn't really seen at the time. And then it ends again on that kind of music and those quotes, and so it's just, the whole thing is just framed, which I think is amazing, like that.
Like you've had a fever dream and you can get up now. You can be released back into the world. I wish I'd seen it in the theater in 1980. I was 12. I didn't get the chance, but I would have loved to have seen how an audience would process that. Have you seen it in the theater?
I've seen it in the theater many times. Well, 3 or 4 probably, but not in 1980.
Yeah, I caught to it in the 90s.
I think I saw it when I was 12 or 13. There's a cinema in London called the New Yorker that I used to go to, the buddy, and I think I saw it on the big screen the first time there. I saw it on VHS the first few times, but like any great movie, seeing it on the big screen is what really blows you away, because you really hear all the sound design and the imagery, and it's something that I try to see, like, on the big screen once every 3 to 5 years, wherever it's around at a cinematheque.
I think it's got to play repertory forever. It's just one of those movies that should never go away.
No, it's so timeless.
Yeah. And so the final question is always the same. And we've kind of dealt with it really, which is what of the film have you kept or borrowed or stolen? What of it is in your creative DNA now?
Mm-hmm.
Anything beyond what we talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what I've tried to take from it and what I try to learn as a director each time I do a movie is just how to kind of deal with tone and stylization and merging different types of styles into something unified. And that's one of the things, like we spoke about before, that I just think is so amazing, how blending that naturalistic acting style, which I love so much, with a certain stylization and a certain kind of poetic quality, which gives it a higher meaning, and trying to just learn from that and take from that, to me is kind of the biggest lesson from Raging Bull. But I think it's also the most elusive thing, because that was done in 1980. I can't believe that's 35 years ago, and a lot of those techniques have kind of now become kind of overused, and so it's also a call to arms and a kind of a challenge to come up with new kind of brave techniques, and approach a story in such a brave way, and somehow try to get away with it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it kind of does. I mean, it's something to shoot for, if nothing else, like something to.
It's an inspiration,
to, yeah.
and all those great movies. That's what they are ultimately, is inspirations. It's the reason that that I do what I do, is because of movies like that inspired me at a young age, and so it's probably why you do what you do, is because these movies inspire us to do this, and so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's never that easy of a business to do, and so unless you're inspired,
Yeah. No, it's a good way to describe it. I'm sort of chasing the high, of the next great film, and then they don't really come any more intoxicating than Raging Bull.
Yeah.
It's something. My thanks to Robert Budreau, whose new film, Born to be Blue, opens in Toronto this Friday, March 11th, expanding across Canada in the weeks to come, and opening in the US on March 25th. Thanks also to Carrie Wolf. She knows what she did. Robert's not on Twitter, but you can keep track of Born to be Blue by following New Reel Films, all one word, Reel with an A, and you can find Raging Bull on Blu-ray and DVD from 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment. It's also available for sale or rental on iTunes, but obviously you're going to want the 30th anniversary Blu-ray, which is just packed with extras. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner, and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, or on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. If you want to leave a review on iTunes, well, be as mean as you like, but you'll never get me down. You'll never get me down. Thanks for listening.